Hey y'all, so I am back and I am starting a new series of brief videos about things that entrepreneurs who are getting ready to do a round of fundraising or who just brought on their first investors, big investors especially, should be aware of. Why am I targeting this demographic of entrepreneur? Because in my experience, it's the point, right before you bring on investors or right after you bring on your first investors when a lot of the operational and managerial expectations for how you're running the business start to change. This is kind of the point when you go from that real true startup phase to the phase where maybe there's people involved that don't have a personal relationship with you or that you haven't worked with in the past, and there does have to be an expectation and a little bit more of the formalities of actually running a business, which is something that a lot of especially early stage founders aren't always thinking about at the very beginning. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my first tip for that right now, but also just be aware that there are more videos along these same lines, a couple more coming out. And if you have suggestions for other topics or questions that you have along these same lines, feel free to post them in the comments down below. Also, I would like to point out, I have only done a couple of videos, but I am officially a professional. I've decided because I finally learned to put my cell phone on airplane mode while I was recording because I keep getting phone calls in the middle of my recording, and then I have to start all over or like attempt to poorly edit the videos together, and it just doesn't go well for anyone. So officially professional level here. Everyone's excited. Between that and not being in an airport, I'm like really at the top of my game now. But going back to the point, first thing that I want to talk about in relation to things that entrepreneurs at this stage of business should keep in mind is what is required technically of you to call a meeting. So as kind of a primer and background for all of these videos, the documents you're going to want to be referencing are your operating agreement, your bylaws, your partnership agreement, or potentially the business organization's code of whatever state you're operating in if you don't have any of your own internal operating agreements. But really it's the document that outlines how the internal governance of your business works. That's the document that I'm going to be asking y'all to reference for this first set of videos. And so our first topic is how to go about calling a meeting. And along those same lines, understanding when certain meetings need to be called. So something that a lot of early stage founders don't keep in mind is that there are specific procedures outlined either in your own internal governance documents or in the business organizations code for how you go about calling meetings of specific groups of people. So be it your managers, your officers, your shareholders, your stockholders, your board of directors, whatever group of people that you're dealing with. There are specific procedures regarding how to go about calling those meetings. So that includes maybe a base time of notice that's required. So maybe you're required to give everyone who should be in attendance at the meeting 48 hours notice, or maybe you're required to notify them in writing at a certain address, or maybe you're required to notify them via email. All of those things are things to keep in mind. How do you go about actually calling the meeting? So I'm not going to talk right now about what happens once the meeting has been called and you're at the meeting, but just calling the meeting itself has a lot of procedural technicalities. Like I said, keeping in mind time, keeping in time method of calling the meeting, keeping in mind who needs to be informed of the meeting. So is it only certain managers? Is it only certain officers? Is it only certain types of shareholders or stockholders? Keeping in mind who can call the meeting, because not everyone always has the right to call a meeting of certain groups of people. So making sure that the right person has called the meeting. Why do these things matter on a practical level? These things matter for a number of reasons. The most important really being that if a meeting is not properly called, pursuant to the internal operating agreements of the business or the business organizations code, whatever you're operating under, if a meeting is not properly called, then anything that happens at that meeting could potentially be deemed invalid. So, for example, if I improperly call a meeting of the board of directors and the board of directors votes on something and makes a decision and then acts on that decision, and the shareholders are angry about that, they could potentially say that that action was not properly taken and thus is invalid, is not a valid action of the company or the entity, whatever it is, and potentially either attempt to overturn or say that the signing of that contract was not allowed and it wasn't properly signed on behalf of the company. A board member or a officer could potentially be held personally liable for some of those things. It really varies wildly depending on the situation, but the important thing to keep in mind is that it may not be a valid action. So keeping in mind the formalities that go into how to call those meetings is extremely important, because one of the first things someone looking to overturn an action they don't agree with is going to look for is, did they mess up in any of the technicalities in calling the meeting, running the meeting, or anything of that nature. There is a reason that all of these rules exist and all of them are outlined in your operating agreement. It's important to know what they are and be familiar with them. Have you or work with an attorney to make a little cheat sheet for you to say, here's the notice that's required, here's how the meeting needs to be run, here's who needs to be notified, all of that stuff, so that you can just quick reference it at the beginning and you don't have to spend a bunch of time hunting through a document or asking your attorney to do it and then probably paying a bill for it. Things to keep in mind, quick tips. I will be back with some at a later date, but hopefully that was a good start and provide you with something you didn't already know. Like I said, feel free to leave questions below in the comments or send me a message if you have another question. Thanks.